I think it's pretty safe to say, and if we're honest, we can see it on ourselves, that our minds and hearts tend to be way too narrow. And if we've learned anything from the campaign and the election, it's that our hearts are way too narrow. And it's true also, that might be one of the sources, but even our religion tends to keep our minds and hearts way too narrow. Today's a good feast. Today is a good opportunity, this feast, to examine that more in depth. You know, I think it was true for centuries, and it's still true, I'm sure, for many Christians, including Catholics, that we imagine that Christ, rose from the dead and looking pretty much the way he did before his crucifixion. And then he rose up, in the sight of his disciples, and I guess they imagine that he's sitting on a cloud or somewhere, or on a planet near Alpha Centauri somewhere, waiting for the parousia. And then he's going to come back, and appear on a cloud, I don't know, somewhere, somehow. And no! Come on. This is why I love readings like the second reading we have today. One of many magnificent passages that we have in the New Testament that describe the mystery of Christ. Who Christ really is. What the dimensions of Christ really are. So here we have the assertion that he is the image of the invisible God. We're talking about Christ now. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things were created. In him all things were created. Whether in heaven or on earth, visible or invisible, thrones, dominations, principalities, and powers, all things were created through him, for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together, have consistency in him. This is a cosmic vision. And we're talking about Christ. I mean, the beginning of the prologue of St. John, that magnificent passage which we use, especially on Christmas, Christmas Day, the Mass of Christmas Day, we read that, for example. That, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. Through him all things were made, and without him was nothing made that was made. In him was the life, and the life was the light of humanity. But here, in these epistles, it's even clearer that we're talking about not just the pre-existent Word, but Christ. Which is meaning that, the Christ mystery obviously took a face in Jesus, but the Christ mystery was already at work before the appearance of the man Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus of Nazareth is entirely and completely and forever, from before eternity and into eternity, identified personally with that mystery, which is the feast we're celebrating, and above time, always identified with that. But in the unraveling of time, in our time and space continuum, the Christ mystery began before Jesus. As many theologians and spiritual writers are saying today, the Christ mystery began with the Big Bang. In other words, the manifestation of God in his Word through whom all things were created. The presentation of the mystery of God in creation. The joining of created and uncreated. The coming together of divine and spirit and matter. But that's the mystery of Christ, made personal in Jesus and forever identified with him. But so you can say that in Jesus, from all eternity and for all eternity, all things were created. All things were created through him and for him, and in him all things hold together. We encounter that eternal cosmic mystery in the risen Christ, the incarnate, crucified, and risen Christ. That's a way bigger mystery than we're normally aware of. And we need to recapture that sense of cosmic awe in the sense of the infinity of God, of the infinity of Christ, who embraces all things. You know, we believe that Christ rose from the dead in his body, but some have rightly pointed out that if we were actually there to see it, we would have seen a flash of light. Wouldn't have been this guy holding a flag. But that's the dimension of it. As Jesus himself said, the appearance of the Son of Man would be like a lightning bolt from one end of the sky to the other. And it really does include all things. And especially today's reading help us to understand the magnificence of this mystery, the depth, the poignancy, the mercy, the love, the unsuspected depth when we have the gospel today. Where is Christ King? On the cross. Well, there go all our narrow views and our silly notions of what kingship means, standing aloof, undisturbed, unattainable, invulnerable, and making your will felt, as some rulers like to make it in our own human world. No. As the ancient Christian line says, God reigns from the cross, Deus regnavit alignio. The kingship is on the cross, on the wood of the cross, and we see that today. The king is crucified. The king is dying. The king is being destroyed and reviled, because so are we, very often, in history. Injustice, cruelty, death. What kind of king would be king of the universe, in whom all things were created, if he were not also king with us in that? That's why the mysterious phrase comes up here. He is the beginning and the firstborn of the dead. What king would even want to claim that? And yet that is exactly who Christ is. He's firstborn of the dead. The phrase comes up also in the book of Revelation. Same phrase. The firstborn of the dead. And it's explained a little bit in the 4th chapter of Ephesians, where it says, he ascended into heaven. Now what does that mean? The author says, perhaps St. Paul. What does that mean except that he first descended into the very depths of the earth, so that he could fill all things. Not just the high and the elevated and the light and the majestic, but the dark and the sorrowful and the dying and the distressful and the despairing. So he could fill all things. That's exactly what Colossians says today, so that he may have primacy in everything, including death and pain and the dark parts of our lives. That's the unimaginable beauty and depth and mercy of Christ's kingship. That he is with us precisely in death and pain and misery and injustice, which he himself bears first of all with us. But he brings his light down into that depth. Primacy can be his in everything. And that is such a consoling and inspiring element of Christ's kingship, that he is there with us in that. And so he rises from the dead and brings all things with him. All of creation is included, as it was included when from the beginning of the incarnation. It's included also and finds its fulfillment in the ascension and the resurrection. That Christ fills all things. And here's where our narrowness comes into play again. We think, well, of course, we Catholics, sometimes even we Christians, but we Catholics especially, we have Christ. Christ is in our box, in our bag here. We've got Christ in the Eucharist here. But meanwhile, we're fighting often with other Christians about, is Jesus really here with us? Do they have the real presence? Do they have really Christ with us? And we're fighting away in our buildings here. And meanwhile, Christ is filling the whole universe. If you want to find Christ, you don't have to just sit in front of the tabernacle, which is fine, but just go out and look at a leaf. then you'll experience Christ. If you're awake, if you're really alive to the pulsations of the energy of the Spirit and the risen body of Christ, which fills the whole universe, not just our tabernacles, but the whole universe. I'm not making this up. St. Paul says to the Ephesians, he's the head of the body, the church, the fullness of him who fills the universe in all its parts. Who fills all things in all things, literally. Now, if Christ fills all things in his risen body, then what or who is excluded? Nothing. Nobody. Fills the universe in all its parts. All things in all things. Colossians in the chapter 3, the same letter we're reading today, says Christ, there's no longer Jew or Greek, slave or free, but Christ is all in all. So, why can't we see that? Christ is everything and everyone and everything. There's a wonderful Zen story about building a sanctuary, building a temple. And they plant a blade of grass and say, there's the temple. Well, it's true for us too. Where is Christ not? So we need to open or allow the Spirit of the risen Christ, to open our minds and our hearts to see and feel and act in the dimensions of the risen Christ, who fills the universe in all its parts, who is all in all. If we really believe Christ is King of the universe, then how can that not be true? So if we really are at the dimensions of Christ, through whom all things were created, for whom all things are created, the Alpha and the Omega of the entire universe. Well, if we really believe that, well, let's live that. Let's allow our minds and hearts to be exploded open to those dimensions. And then our country, our world, our church will be enlivened and saved and reformed and be able to change the world. Do we really believe Christ is King of the universe? Well, okay, prove it.